Today I'm going to show a video of how I make this logo bar for a 36-inch prism. The idea is that this bar will get actually nailed, pinned into the prism, and what it does is allows me to mold the prism without having to worry about all these letters, which are somewhat difficult in green sand, especially in this particular mold, to reproduce. So what I'm going to do instead is mold these individually using resin-bound sand, and then we'll pin these into the prism later. I'll show you some more about that in subsequent videos, but that's where we're headed. And to do that, we're going to make this cope and drag of a resin-bound mold. So this is epoxy resin and olivine sand. I use 2% or so, maybe 3%, isn't really critical, of resin by weight versus sand. And these two pieces will come together. You can see that I've cut a channel here that will allow metal into the mold. You can also see there's a crack here. And that's because for the flasks that I use to make these molds, I don't think I had enough draft, and I've changed that subsequently. But anyway, these two pieces mesh nicely together, and this whole works will be then set into a green sand mold. That may seem crazy, but it's a nice way to have a epoxy-bound mold that allows for excellent detail rendition, but I don't have to waste a whole block of sand to get that little bit of resolution. I make these two pieces. I use this pattern right here in the green sand to make a recess into which this will fit. And here's where the metal's going to come into that cavity, and it will line up with that hole and fill. That's how I made this one. Worked pretty nicely. So let's go through a little bit how I do this. Here is the 3-degree drafted mold that resulted in some difficulty really getting the sand out. I got it, but I broke the one side, which I then subsequently glued back together with cyanoacrylate glue or crazy glue, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, these sides these flasks have 3 degrees of draft here. And that's what I used to make this particular set. I went ahead and reprinted basically the same thing, except with 5 degrees of draft, which should make removal of the sand easier. We'll see. You get a chance to find out about that later. To make the impression of the letters and the bar, I use this pattern in the sand. And we'll put that together in a minute. But this piece fits into this piece. You can see the recess here to allow for the letters and fits up nice and tight. Then this piece goes on top like so. And I stuff the whole works with sand. And that'll make 1/2 of this mold right here. So let's go ahead and see if we can get that job done. I will say that these are 3D printed in PETG, that I did print them with 0.1 millimeter layer height, so pretty fine layer heights. And then I filed it a little bit to take out any of the CD like ridging that you feel, the layer lines, and sanded it a bit. And then of course I wax it with a good quality wax. This is the particular wax I'm using right now, but I think any good quality automotive wax would work. And that means that I wax all the surfaces that sand are going to see. That includes eventually this side, which you can see a little bit of residual wax in there. But I wax that, and then I use a brush to remove excessive wax and polish it a bit with a shop towel to get it nice and smooth. So drop that in there like so. If I can get it to fall in. Maybe better use both. There we go. Want it to be registered in. It is not a tight fit. There's a little bit of slack, but that keeps this piece from shifting around while I stuff this flask with sand. Okay, I think we're ready to go. Up here, I've measured out 80 grams of 100 mesh olivine sand. I know that's a little more than I think it'll take to fill that. And here I have a syringe with ordinary 1 to 5 epoxy. This is the resin and this is the hardener. It's a West system that I use, though I think any conventional 1 to 5 epoxy would work. And I suppose you could even use a 5-minute epoxy, but that would make things a little bit tight, I think, time-wise. So to do this, since I have 80 grams here, and I want to use about 2 to 3%, I'm going to put in about 2 cc's. This isn't real critical as to just how much is used, but there's 2 cc's of the ordinary resin, and I approximate about a fifth of this. Again, those mixing ratios, if you're building an airplane or a boat, you better be really exact, but in this case, I found that I can get away with some slop. And then I just use a piece of wood stick and mix up the resin well, back and forth and round. And again, if this were a critical application, I'd be even more careful than this, but this has worked out well. The hardener has taken on some color because it's old, but to West's credit, they specifically say that even though with age the components may change color, they do not lose their effectiveness, and that has proven to be, in fact, true. So there we are, pretty well mixed up, I think. And then what I do is just pour in some, not all, maybe a third or so of the sand, and start mixing it. Works easier to not put in all the sand, and in fact, these containers that I'm using are just a little undersized. I really should have something slightly bigger, but I can get by. And we'll dribble out a little bit of sand, I'm pretty sure. But there, we're getting started. And we'll put in the rest. And to try to reinforce it a little bit, I put a couple cups underneath, like that. And then I put my hand around the cup to contain the sand a little better. And for this, I do try to be pretty careful to get good mixing. Meaning I look up at my clock, which you can't see, but I mix for about a minute here. So bear with me while we do that. And what we're going to see at the end is sand that you'll say, man, if you're used to using green sand, you'll say, that looks way too dry. That'll never mold properly. But actually, all we're trying to do is get a thin coat on every grain. And if we pack those grains together, I'll guarantee you that they lock up nicely and make a good mold. The other good thing about the resin, the epoxy, is that it is a carbon source, and that helps prevent burn on of sand, if you know what about that. And it also gives a nice shiny finish to the cast iron part. So I think that's probably pretty well mixed up there. I always try to scrape to the bottom and make sure that I'm not leaving gobs of sand or sand that has got a whole lot of excess resin in it. So here's a little bit that worked its way out. We'll just dump that back in. We'll reassemble this and dribble in some sand. Just tap it in like that. And I hold down, I'm putting a little pressure on the bar mold, the smaller piece inside. And that'll help keep it in place. Once the sand is packed in a bit, then things tend to stabilize in terms of position. But I like to, again, have it not shift off center too much. It doesn't have to, technically doesn't have to be perfectly centered for any special reason, but it seems better to keep it that way, and I think it's more, makes it more reliable mold. I do think, based on prior experience, that packing the sand in fairly tight is an important factor here. Early on when I was doing this, I didn't pack it in quite so tight, and I had poorer bonding of the sand. But I have found that if I tap it into place, and here I'm just using this screwdriver, a square drive screwdriver, to tap the sand down fairly firmly. Again, you'd swear that the sand is just too dry, but it seems to work out. Now, as I press on it with my fingers, excuse me, that's packed in tightly enough that it barely, if at all, deforms. And then I just screed it off. Like so. Again, being a little bit careful to hold some pressure on this assembly so that things don't go skittering around. And there we are. So what happens next is I'll take this out and put it in the sun, where it'll heat up to maybe 120, 130 degrees or so. And that greatly accelerates the setup. If I didn't do that, I think it would take 12 hours for that resin sand combination to set up firmly. But if I put it out in the sun, I'll get by with just 2 or 3 hours. I guess I won't film that whole 2 to 3 hours while it's sitting in the sun. I'll save you that. So that's the next step. I'm going to take this, put it aside, and then we'll come back and revisit it later when we make the other half of the mold.